The first few days in the new house were nothing extraordinary. Amanda and Ben had spent months searching for a place they could call their own, and when they found it, a charming two-story home at the end of a quiet street, they knew it was meant to be. The neighborhood felt safe, the houses neatly lined up with little yards, surrounded by white picket fences. The air was fresh, the kind that carried the scent of grass and the promise of a fresh start. On that first morning, Amanda stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun stretch across the yard, casting long shadows on the freshly mowed lawn. It was a peaceful sight. Outside, Ben was in the driveway, unloading boxes from the back of their car, taking his time with each item. They'd agreed to take the move slow, no rush, just like how they'd agreed to make this house their home, step by step. The house itself was nothing spectacular, but there was something about it. The walls were a soft beige, the floors creaked a little when you walked on them, and the staircase had a certain charm that Amanda found nostalgic, almost like something from her childhood. The living room with its wide windows felt inviting. She could already imagine the couch they would pick out, the way she'd spend lazy afternoons reading or watching TV in that spot. Ben had made a habit of cracking jokes about how many empty rooms they had, but his laugh had a kind of lightness to it, the kind that only someone content in their own space could have. He wasn't the type to get excited over things, but the way he smiled at her, standing in the doorway as if he'd already lived here for years, made Amanda feel at ease. The house felt like it was settling around them, slow, steady, like it had always been waiting. As days passed, Amanda got into the rhythm of daily life. She unpacked slowly, enjoying the process, finding new spots for the old trinkets that had followed them from place to place. There was no rush. Ben had begun taking long evening walks, which she didn't mind. She often liked the house to herself for a little while. The sound of the wind rattling the windows at night became a background hum. At first, it was easy to ignore, just the usual noises of a house finding its own way. But Amanda would sometimes pause, listening, before shaking her head with a smile. It was probably the house settling again. Everything felt normal, peaceful, but there were moments, fleeting ones, when the feeling lingered a bit too long. Moments when she would walk down the hall and the air would feel colder than it should be, or when she would glance into a room only to find it empty when she swore she had just heard footsteps. She would shake off the thoughts, busying herself with the next task at hand. The house was old after all. It creaked, it sighed, like any home with a past. It wasn't until that evening, when the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, that something shifted, though Amanda couldn't yet put her finger on it. She had just finished dinner when she felt it. A sudden unease, like the air itself had thickened just slightly. She stood by the window, her fingers brushing the cool glass, looking out into the yard. There, in the dimming light, she noticed the faintest movement, a shadow. It was gone before she could focus on it, swallowed by the encroaching dusk. But it had been there. Nothing much to it, she told herself. Probably just her imagination. She wasn't sure, though. Something in the back of her mind told her she wasn't alone. The following days passed in the same steady rhythm. Amanda grew more accustomed to the house, its sounds, its subtle quirks. Each morning she would brew her coffee in the kitchen, watching the first light creep across the backyard, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. There was something calming about the routine, the sense of control over their new space. Ben would leave for work early, leaving her to settle into the day, her movements slow and deliberate as she tackled the unpacking. One afternoon, as she was putting away the last of the kitchenware, she noticed a small detail she hadn't seen before. There, beneath the kitchen table, was an old, faded rug. She hadn't remembered it being there when they moved in. The pattern was familiar, like something from another time, antique almost, but she couldn't quite place where she had seen it before. Amanda crouched down to inspect it, her fingers brushing over the worn fibers. It didn't look like something that belonged to the house, and yet, there it was, tucked into the corner, as though it had always been part of the place. Shrugging it off, she carried on with her task, but the rug lingered in her thoughts. Why hadn't she noticed it sooner? And who had put it there? It didn't seem like something Ben would have left behind, especially with how meticulous he was about setting things up. But again, it was a small thing. It could have been there all along. Maybe she just hadn't been paying attention. Ben, as usual, was gone when she found it. He'd started leaving earlier for work, and his late nights at the office had become a regular part of their schedule. Amanda didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she enjoyed it. The house, though large, felt cozy when it was quiet, and the occasional sounds of the wind or the creaking floorboards were comforting. One evening after dinner, Amanda found herself standing at the top of the stairs, looking down the hallway. She had been upstairs unpacking some boxes when she decided to take a break, standing there for a moment, absent-mindedly staring at the long stretch of the hallway that led to the rooms. A sense of stillness filled the air, and for a brief second, she thought she heard something. Not a sound she could identify, just a faint as though the house itself was breathing. She turned her head, but nothing was out of place. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of darkness into the otherwise well-lit hallway. She stepped closer, her footsteps quiet against the old wooden floor. There was nothing to see, no one there, but the door seemed to be hanging open, almost expectantly. She hesitated, wondering if she should close it, but the thought slipped away as quickly as it had come. She left it be and walked back downstairs, the faint feeling of being watched lingering at the back of her mind. She didn't tell Ben about it when he returned that evening. It wasn't the sort of thing you mentioned without sounding paranoid, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling. Little things like the rug, or the way the air felt heavier sometimes, tugged at her consciousness. It wasn't much, just small, almost unnoticeable shifts in the atmosphere, but they were enough to make her question whether this house, this seemingly perfect home, had always been as empty as she had thought. She shook off the thought, making herself a cup of tea, and sat on the couch, trying to focus on the quiet comfort of the evening. Ben came in later, tired but cheerful, and they spent the night like they always did, in easy conversation, the mundane details of their lives flowing freely. But Amanda couldn't fully relax. There was something underneath it all, something she couldn't quite reach. And that night, as she lay in bed, the house settled around her. The soft creaks echoed through the silence. But there was one sound that stood out, a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. She held her breath, listening. The sound came from above, from the attic, the one room they hadn't ventured into yet. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly reminded herself it was probably just the house adjusting. Old homes did that. Still, as the tapping continued, Amanda couldn't help but feel that the house was waiting, just as it had been all along, waiting for something. The tapping from the attic hadn't stopped by morning. Amanda lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of it, her mind still foggy from sleep. It was soft at first, but as the minutes dragged on, the sound seemed to grow clearer, more deliberate. She turned toward Ben, but he was still asleep, his face relaxed in the quiet comfort of slumber. She could hardly bring herself to wake him for something so trivial. It had to be the house settling, right? Just the usual creaks and groans. The kind of thing every old house did after a shift in the temperature or a gust of wind. Still, there was a strange consistency to the tapping, like it was trying to communicate something. When she got up to start her day, the house felt different. The air, though still cool, seemed heavier, as if it was thick with anticipation. She moved through the kitchen with a familiar rhythm, coffee brewing, light filtering through the curtains. But something about the space felt off, like a shadow lurking just behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing there. The house was empty, of course, but the sensation clung to her as she carried on, stirring her coffee a little too vigorously, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. By the time Ben left for work, Amanda couldn't quite shake the unease. She'd already cleaned up the kitchen, wiped down the counters, but the sight of that rug, still there, still tucked in the corner of the kitchen, stirred something in her. She hadn't given it much thought after the initial discovery, but now it seemed out of place. No one had mentioned it, not even Ben. Why would it be there? She knelt down, running her hand over the fabric once more, but this time it felt colder than before, as if the rug itself had absorbed the chill of the house overnight. Her thoughts wandered back to the attic. Ben had mentioned that they'd need to check it eventually, maybe to store some of the boxes. But he hadn't seemed particularly eager about it, and neither had she. It was one of those things that could be pushed off until later, until it felt less uncomfortable. She decided to go upstairs and poke her head into the guest room. Maybe it would be a good distraction. But as she approached, something caught her eye. The door to the room was open wider than it had been the day before. Just a little, but enough to make her pause. She didn't remember leaving it that way. Amanda stood there for a moment, staring at the gap. The faintest trace of cold air drifted from inside, a draft she hadn't noticed before. She could almost hear the hum of the house again, that strange, vibrating silence, like the walls were trying to tell her something. She wanted to step inside, to find some logical reason for why the door was ajar, but a sense of hesitation gripped her. It wasn't a fear she could name, just a quiet, unsettling urge to keep her distance. Instead, she backed away slowly and turned toward the hallway. But as she did, she saw something else. The hallway light, which had been switched off when she went upstairs, flickered faintly. A brief, stuttering pulse of light, barely perceptible. Amanda froze. It wasn't much, just a brief flicker. She stood still for a few seconds, her breath shallow, waiting for it to happen again. But it didn't. Maybe it was the wiring, she thought. Old houses had quirks like that, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping just out of reach, like she was on the edge of noticing something important, but couldn't quite put her finger on it. She quickly turned and descended the stairs, trying to ignore the thoughts building up like a haze in her mind. Downstairs, she grabbed her phone and scrolled through her messages, anything to distract herself from the mounting discomfort. But even as she tried to bury herself in something mundane, she couldn't shake the sense that the house was waiting for her to notice something she hadn't yet seen. She paused and glanced over at the kitchen again. The rug was still there, where it had always been, but for some reason, now it seemed more out of place than before, as if it didn't belong to this house at all. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the house was not just a space, but a presence, one that was waiting for something. The oddities, the flickers of light, the strange tapping from the attic, all of it had built up to this point. She tried to ignore it, to tell herself it was just the quirks of an old house settling in. But the deeper she delved into the house's routine, the more she felt something stirring beneath the surface, something ancient and restless. That evening, after Ben had left for work, the house felt unnervingly still. The silence wrapped around her, thick and heavy, making her movements feel foreign in her own home. She went upstairs to grab something from the bedroom, but the moment she stepped onto the landing, she froze. The guest room door was wide open. She hadn't left it that way. She knew she hadn't. Her heart began to race, her chest tightening as she slowly stepped forward. The air felt thick in the hallway, like it was holding its breath, and a coldness settled over her skin, pricking her with goosebumps. Her hand hovered over the doorframe, her fingers trembling, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. But then she heard it, the sound that had been haunting her for days. The tapping. This time, though, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from inside the room. A sharp, repetitive sound, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the other side of the door. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Her body was paralyzed, each breath shallow, as if the very act of exhaling might make her a target. Slowly, unwillingly, she stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the dust that had begun to settle on the floor, untouched since the move. But the air was different here. It was colder, a thick, oppressive cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes scanning the space, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. And then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, beneath the window, was the rug. But it wasn't in the corner anymore. It had moved. It was positioned in the center of the room now, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The faded pattern seemed to writhe beneath the dim light, its colors shifting in ways that didn't seem possible. Amanda's breath hitched as she took another step closer. The tapping continued, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound. It was a command, a beckoning, pulling her in. The door slammed shut behind her, and she spun around, heart pounding. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with an unseen weight. Her pulse raced as she tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was locked in. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. Her eyes snapped back to the rug, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The edges of the rug began to ripple, as though something beneath it was moving. The fabric twisted and writhed, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Amanda could have sworn she saw something dark and shifting beneath the surface. A cold gust of wind swept her through the room, and Amanda gasped, her hands trembling. The temperature dropped even further, the air now biting at her skin. The room felt alive, as though it had taken on a mind of its own. Shadows curled and stretched along the walls, moving with an unnatural rhythm, and Amanda's throat tightened as she struggled to breathe. There was something in the room with her, something she couldn't see, but could feel, pressing in around her. It was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The tapping was deafening now, vibrating through the floorboards, the walls. the very air. Desperation clawed at her as she grabbed the door handle again, pulling with all her strength. It didn't give. The cold pressed in harder, and she felt something. A brush of air, a faint whisper of a touch, sweep across the back of her neck. It was so close, she could almost feel the presence standing right behind her. The shadows seemed to darken, growing thicker, until they nearly swallowed the room whole. Amanda's mind raced, her heart beat loud in her ears. She had to get out. She had to. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the room. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. Too still. The room was silent. The shadows were gone. The air, once freezing, had returned to its normal stuffy heaviness. But something had changed. Amanda wasn't sure what, but she knew deep down that the house had moved. The game had shifted, and whatever had been waiting for her was closer now. The darkness enveloped her, swallowing her whole until there was no light, no air, only the crushing weight of it. Amanda felt herself being pulled, dragged deeper into the cold, unyielding blackness. It was as if she were sinking into the house itself, into something ancient and insatiable, something that had been waiting for her. Her mind screamed, but her body betrayed her, numb and motionless, caught in the relentless grip of the shadows. Time felt meaningless, stretching and warping in the absence of light. The world around her reduced to nothing but the faint echoes of her own heartbeat. Then, just as the last breath of air left her lungs, the pull stopped. Suddenly there was a sound, faint at first like the rustling of fabric, but it grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the room, each step heavy with a presence. Amanda's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing in response. She couldn't see, couldn't move, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking toward her. The footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, a cold hand brushed against her cheek. It was the lightest of touches, barely there, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Her mind raced, the pieces of the world beginning to fall back into place as her senses slowly returned. She could feel the floor beneath her, solid and real, and the oppressive weight of the shadows receded, leaving her gasping for air. She opened her eyes, blinking against the darkness, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then, just as she thought she could gather her bearings, a voice, low, guttural and familiar, spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." Amanda froze. The voice echoed through her mind, wrapping around her like a serpent, tightening its grip. She knew that voice. It was Ben's. But Ben had left hours ago, hadn't he? A sudden flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned, her heart in her throat, and there, standing in the doorway, was Ben. His eyes were dark, almost empty, and his face was expressionless, as if the man she knew had vanished, replaced by something else. Something wrong. But then she noticed something even more unsettling. Behind him, in the shadows, the outline of a figure shifted, dark, indistinct, like a silhouette that was too real to be a mere trick of the light. The shadows seemed to pulse and writhe around it, as though the room itself was alive, reacting to its presence. Ben didn't speak again. He just stood there, staring at her, the coldness in his eyes deepening. The figure behind him moved, taking a step forward, and Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, tried to run, but her body wouldn't obey. And then, Just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. The room was empty again. Ben's eyes softened. "It's too late," he said quietly, his voice breaking through the silence like a distant echo. "We're already part of it now." Amanda's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. What was happening? What was he saying? The shadows around her seemed to stir once more, and as her vision blurred, she felt herself being pulled toward them. But this time, it wasn't the darkness she feared. It was Ben. As everything around her faded to black, she could still hear him, his voice, the faintest whisper. "You should have never come back." And then, silence. When Amanda opened her eyes again, the house was still. But there was something different now. She wasn't sure what it was. An absence, a hollow space. But she knew that whatever she had been drawn into, whatever had waited for her, was far from over. There was something waiting for her at the edges of her mind, something she couldn't fully understand. But it was there. And this time, it wasn't going to let her go. The house, it seemed, had chosen its next visitor.